Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on Altinity.Cloud. My name is Robert Hodges. I'll be joined by Alexander Zaitsev. We are going to give people just a couple minutes here to come in. We have a number of signups, and so we'll give them about a minute or two, and then we're going to dive into this presentation. So I'm going to go on mute, and we'll be right back. Okay, everyone, welcome. Let's get started. This is the introduction to Altinity.Cloud, our platform for real-time analytics on ClickHouse. My name is Robert Hodges, and I'm joined today by Alexander Zaitsev. Before we get started, just a couple of things. One, I'd like to do a quick sound check. Alexander, can you confirm that sound is on and you see video fully?
A good day, everybody.
Great. Let's see. Let me just check that. Oh, good. Everything's good to go. Sorry about the delay here. So a couple things that to help you enjoy this. This is a Zoom webinar, and so we have a bunch of people in the audience. If you want to pose questions, feel free to put them into the question and answer box, or you can put them in the chat. Either way, we'll take the questions. If they're relevant to what we're talking about, we'll take them right as we come along. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end to do Q&A. You also don't have to take frantic notes or take screenshots of the slides. Everything's being recorded, and we're also posting slides. So you will get a copy of the talk, both as a video link as well as the link to the slides to review at your leisure. So with that, I'd like to jump in and make some quick introductions. So I'm Robert Hodges. Once again, I'm CEO of Altinity. I've been working with databases this coming in next year. It'll be 40 years. And I have with me Alexander Zaitsev, who's I think about 25. Alexander, is that correct?
25 years of working with databases. Yeah, maybe like something like that. And I'm co-founder and CTO of Altinity. We'll be happy to talk about Altinity.Cloud today.
And he's also the designer of this system that we're going to be looking at. So for you in the audience, we are assume that you're application developers, you're looking to build real-time analytics to solve real business problems, but you don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time running infrastructure. Altinity as a company, quick introduction. So we are an enterprise provider for ClickHouse. We have enterprise support. We also have cloud services that run ClickHouse. That's, of course, the topic of this talk. We are authors of a number of open source packages. One of the most significant ones, particularly for this talk, is the Kubernetes operator for ClickHouse. It was the first operator ever written for a data warehouse in Kubernetes, and even today is one of the most popular database operators on GitHub. So with that, let's just jump in and introduce you very quickly to Altinity.Cloud, and then so we can shift over a demo and you can actually see it running. So Altinity.Cloud is a SaaS, a software as a service for ClickHouse. The idea is it runs in the cloud. It completely operates all operations, and it has baked in enterprise DBA support. So you're not just it's not just a panel where you go click a few buttons and things run, but you're on your own when something goes wrong or you have questions. We also have we have a highly expert support team who have run large clusters, worked with ClickHouse for many years, and they're role is to help you come up to speed quickly on ClickHouse and also cover you when unusual or unexpected things happen. We'll talk about that support model a little bit more in this talk. Altinity.Cloud itself is optimized for real-time analytics, particularly systems that are, for example, do SaaS analytics that are designed to operate at scale across many tenants and constantly. This calls for a special architecture focused on high-performance architecture or high-performance storage and compute, and it also requires a cost model that is well suited for the types of businesses that run these applications. Altinity.Cloud, as we'll show, can support practically any version and any feature of ClickHouse, including the experimental ones. It really runs ClickHouse the same way you do on your laptop, and it runs anywhere. So if you run in our SaaS, in our account, you can run in any Amazon or GCP region, or you can provide your own Kubernetes cluster, and we will manage the ClickHouse clusters there. So just in case anybody on this call does not know what ClickHouse is, very quickly, it's a SQL data warehouse. It runs on everything from bare metal to the cloud. It's kind of like MySQL, but only just able to do very, very scalable analytics. Standard data warehouse types of features like a shared nothing architecture, so compute attached to storage communicating over network, columnar storage, very efficient parallel and vectorized execution, able to scale from a laptop running a few megabytes of data all the way up to clusters with 500 nodes and dealing with tens of petabytes, and it's open source. So it's licensed under an Apache 2 license. This is something we really like about it. Not only that, there's a whole ecosystem of software around it that is similarly licensed, either Apache or some other permissive license. It's a great, great piece of software with great support for building real-time analytics stacks that are completely open source and you can use for any purpose. With that, it's time to switch to a demo and see this in action. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and let Alexander do a quick tour through Altinity.Cloud so you can see how it works.
Thank you, Robert. 1 second. Can you see my screen? Robert, could you confirm you can see my screen?
Sorry, I had already put myself on mute. Yes, I can see it perfectly.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay, great. So this is a cluster page, kind of your dashboard when you manage your ClickHouse clusters. We will go through details a little bit later in this talk. Now I will start a cluster in real time. We'll call that webinar 2, and you will learn why in a second. So basically, here is where you can pick different versions, Altinity stable builds or community builds, and we'll discuss again why and when you need to use certain versions of ClickHouse. So once you configure what version you use, you select what kind of resources you want to throw to this ClickHouse. There are some quotas usually configured for your account. This is just a safety net. It protects users from doing crazy things. Sometimes those quotas depend on what cloud provider allows us to do, and those definitely not fixed. You can raise them if needed. Storage size, number of volumes. So we do support multi-volume configuration. That makes sense in certain configurations. Volume type, we'll go for with GP3. Number of shards. Unlike some of other ClickHouse services, we support sharding. This time we will start 2 shards, for example. Replication, you may go without replication or with replication. And we manage to zookeeper automatically under the covers. So for this exercise, I will start without. Actually, let's start with replicas. So this is your endpoint that you will get. It is created inside the demo account in Altinity.Cloud. But if you are Altinity.Cloud customer, you will get a dedicated third-level domain in Altinity.Cloud, and all your clusters will be using the fourth level domain. This is a public. We can turn it to the private on request, and most of our customers actually running a private private access to ClickHouse. We support two protocols, binary and HTTP. Some of our clients are also using MySQL protocol to access to ClickHouse, but that requires some additional configuration due to MySQL protocol limitations. We will discuss a little bit what we have around metrics and logs, but for customers who want integration with external systems, Datadog is available. So let's go one step further. One of interesting features of Altinity.Cloud is uptime schedule. We will probably discuss it in a bit more detail later, but in a nutshell, it allows you to stop cluster automatically when it's idle. For example, when you don't use a system for development, for example, you may forget to stop it, and we may stop or actually pause it automatically for you, and you can start it anytime when you're back, or you can define a schedule, right? On a work days, you want the cluster to be available at your morning when you come to the office, and shut down automatically when you go home. So for now, we will leave it as always on. So this is a kind of big cluster with 4 nodes, and this actually drives a cost. So this cluster is going to be pretty expensive, but let's start it. The billing model for Altinity.Cloud is very simple. You pay as you go. We get billed from AWS, and we kind of proxy it to you with some extra. If cluster is not running, you don't get billed. So this webinar 2, this is a cluster that I started right now. While it's starting, I will show you one other cool feature, which is called Rescale. I started this cluster with only 1 shard and 1 replica, but later on I decided that I do want replication. This is this time when I can just go here and add another replica. I can also change the node type. I'm not going to do it right now, but you can actually do it with your cluster anytime, scaling it down or scaling it up to bigger node types. And those are just defaults. We can extend this list with any node type that cloud provider supports. I can rescale node storage size here, and this is probably the most frequent operations that Altinity.Cloud customers are doing. They increase the storage because their data grows. On on-prem operation, you're usually limited with your box. In the cloud, there are no limits, and you can go from 30 gigabytes to 30 terabytes, usually not in a one step, but in several steps. So this is how we add a replica. So I'm adding a replica, and the cluster will be online all the time, because adding a replica doesn't require downtime. It happens under the covers. We are provisioning new resources, and in a few minutes it will probably be up and running. So while it is starting, let's see what is happening with our previous cluster. It is still starting. Usually it takes 3 to 5 minutes to start to add a node. So if you have 4 node cluster, it will take initially 20 minutes to start. But after 20 minutes, it's going to be fully up and running. So this is kind of your, in general, your experience when you're starting the cluster. There are a lot of different features here. I will just give a very quick overview without going into detail at all. So things like stop and resume. This is what is happening if you don't need your cluster for some time. You can just stop it and then resume it anytime. You can do any sort of configuration that ClickHouse supports, any server settings. any profile and user settings. This is, so there are no limits, and we'll talk about that in a bit. We have built-in database explorer that allows you to rank queries, to check the schema, to analyze the workloads. So let me switch a cluster to something real. So analyze workloads, analyze replication, analyze data, some data consistency or inconsistency things. These are all very helpful tools for people who, for users who administer ClickHouse. You can configure alerts, and you have access to logs and monitoring data that helps you to operate the system healthy or detect problems of any kind. At this point, I think I will stop showing you the demo and give a control back to Robert to talk about some of the features in more detail.
Thank you, Alexander. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So let's get back to it. Let me know when you can see it. Alexander, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good. What I'm going to do now is go ahead and dig into a little bit more deeply into some of the things that Alexander described and show you a number of the more commonly used features in Altinity.Cloud. So the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about what's going on under the covers. And there's a reason for that, really important one, which I'll get to in just a minute. But first, let's just talk about how it is that Altinity is working and where those clusters live when we set them up. So the clusters that Alexander was showing you, that's that panel with the set of cards on it, is an environment. And an environment, if you dig in, is actually a VPC. In this case, it's running on Amazon using EKS, and it's an Amazon VPC, and inside that VPC is a Kubernetes cluster. So when we start a provision a tenant, for example, if you show up and do a trial, which are free for 2 weeks, by the way, when you start a trial, the first thing we'll do is we'll set up a VPC, all the associated networking. We will then provision a Kubernetes cluster inside it. And then as soon as that's up and running and you log in, you can actually begin to provision clusters. So just as Alexander was showing you inside that demo environment. So here you see the ClickHouse. Now, this same pattern works if you want to go on GCP. So you could provision an environment there, or you could be, what most commonly happens is people are just GCP users, so they pick that instead. Again, you just pick, whichever region you want to run in, and we will go ahead and provision there. So we support practically any cloud environment, and if it's one that we haven't used before, sometimes we have to wait a few hours to get the to get quota increases, but you can basically run in any region. What's interesting is not only can you run in the Amazon and the GCP regions on our account, you can also do it on your own account. And the way that this works, it's a special addition to ClickHouse, which we call, or excuse me, to Altinity.Cloud, which we call Altinity.Cloud Anywhere. And with Anywhere, what you do is you just tell us where your Kubernetes cluster is. So you can set it up in your own VPC. You can run EKS. That's a pretty common way that people do it. And then you register it with Altinity.Cloud. And at that point, we build a secure tunnel to to your environment that can only see inside the Kubernetes environment. In fact, only a couple of namespaces, and then we go ahead and manage your clusters there. So you all know the data, you have the code, and you can meet your compliance requirements. It's tied to your own local networking, so on and so forth. So these are 3 different examples of environments. What I'd like to do now is dig in just a little bit more to what's going on inside an environment. So basically, when we set up one of these environments, as I mentioned, it is a Kubernetes cluster. We're connecting to it over a secure networking link, either private networking, if it's in our own VPCs, or using what we call the Altinity connector for the Anywhere deployments. And then inside it, of course, you have ClickHouse. You then have other services that are necessary to make ClickHouse work, and they include the Altinity operator. That's this piece of software that we wrote that allows us to provision and manage uh, ClickHouse clusters on Kubernetes. We also have services like Grafana and Prometheus, because if you're running clusters, you want to collect metrics, you want to have good monitoring. So those are also present there. And we have other things like there's something called the edge proxy that takes care of routing, and then it basically receives traffic from the cloud provider load balancer, in this case, an Oz network load balancer. All of the services, to the extent they use to the extent they have storage, will allocate block storage, and we'll also use object storage buckets for your backups. So this is what's going on inside this. If you run Altinity.Cloud anywhere, you will actually be able to log into your Kubernetes cluster and see most of these services running yourself. So one of the things that's really important about Altinity.Cloud, and where we differ from just about every other cloud provider, is we operate Altinity.Cloud exactly the way you do it at home. So the software that's running in the stack, and if I back up one screen, this is all open source. This is your ClickHouse, the services that are necessary for your monitoring and other types of things, backup, so on and so forth, as well as the Altinity operator. These are all Apache licensed, or under some similar license that allows you to use them freely for your own applications. So that's really important, because what it means is that you could actually run this yourself. And in fact, if you ever decided that you needed to move it on-prem and manage it directly, you could do that. And in fact, we even have a blog article that describes exactly how to do that. Another thing is that you can run any version of ClickHouse. So as Alexander emphasized, we are basically just running ClickHouse on your behalf. There's no secret to what we're doing. You can pick the versions you want, and you have the choices of different types of builds. We'll talk a little bit about them. Another thing is you can use virtually any feature, including experimental ones. All you have to do is turn them on. One thing that is kind of important about our implementation is that if you have applications that connect to Altinity.Cloud clusters, they must be able to support TLS, and they must be able to use a feature of TLS called server name indications, or SNI, and it is the protocol that allows us to route through a single endpoint and get to whichever server you'd like to be talking to when you're issuing queries. So other than that, basically everything else is something that if you could do it on a laptop, when you load it into Altinity.Cloud, it will work there as well. So with that, I'd like now to step into just some tips and more background for how to develop real-time analytics on Altinity.Cloud. So after you start a trial, you'll come into Altinity.Cloud and you'll see that cluster view, which we just showed in the demo. And what we saw in that view was the launch cluster button. That was what Alexander hit when he began to create the 4-node cluster that he was starting. We also have a series of clusters. Some are stopped and some are running. So the green ones are actually running, and the red ones are stopped. And what we mean by a stopped cluster is that we just stop the compute. So the VMs that are backing that, backing up the nodes, they're just, we let them go. We keep your block storage. So you still do get billed for that, but there's no compute. And for most, particularly for development, compute is by far the lion's share of the cost. So it means that you can actually operate these things very, very efficiently. This is a good time, since we have a number of things here. For example, the versions. And what you can see as you look across, we have a bunch of different versions of ClickHouse. I count about 3 different ones here. And so this is a good time to talk about builds and ideas for which version you should actually use. So ClickHouse produces really great community builds. They come out monthly, and every 6 months is what's called an LTS build. That's a long-term support build, which has a year of support. The monthly builds have what amounts to a month of actual community support. It's actually a little bit longer. If there are, for example, severe bugs, they will get backported. but the community at most will support the LTS builds for 1 year. ClickHouse community builds evolve very rapidly. If you get even a fresh LTS build, there's no guarantee whatsoever. It will certainly contain all the latest and greatest features, and things that are, including experimental ones that are under development. But there's no guarantee it's really suitable for production use. The Altinity stable builds, which we create here at Altinity, are slower moving. They're only based on the LTS builds, and then we go through a certification period that actually lasts several months, where we, sort of test it carefully, gather user experience. Our support team analyzes the outstanding PRs and things that are that have come up in their testing as they operate clusters, and then a few months after the LTS goes out, we declare victory and provide the build, including a bunch of very detailed upgrade instructions. So for operating on production builds, these are for production systems, these are better because they're slower moving, they are more stable, and they tend to avoid problems that pop up. So for example, there was a particular bug related to data corruption that actually popped up on some of the community builds. The Altinity stable builds were not affected by that because they just don't pick up that kind of change very quickly. So this is you're free to make the choice. You can run either way. We strongly recommend for production that you, if you are using community builds, you want to have a talk with us about that, because they often have instability or they may change between versions. So we can help guide you if that's something you feel really need to do. Digging just a little bit deeper about what's going on under the covers is, and this is our when we look inside the cluster itself, one of the things that's interesting is Kubernetes allows us to give access to the cluster as a whole. So for example, there is what's called a cluster endpoint that gives us that's basically a load balancer that will just pick one of the nodes and send the queries there, or you can actually go to explicit nodes. And if you are loading data from Kafka, for example, you often have written applications which go to a specific node because they know what the sharding strategy is and they know how to relate the ClickHouse nodes to particular Kafka partitions. This is or topics. This is something that you can do quite easily. So and in fact, what I'd like to show you is how we would actually figure out how to connect to a node. So let's start with for example, if we want to, if we go back to the cluster dashboard, there we go. Okay, we see that there's a lot of interesting information about what's actually going on inside that cluster. So for example, we have the node type, which is backed by a VM. So anytime you see a cluster, a ClickHouse server, it's actually got a VM underneath it. We are not sharing these VMs with other servers, or excuse me, with other ClickHouse servers. We are certainly not sharing that VM with other tenants. It's all completely isolated. So we can see that this cluster consists of, it's just a cluster of one node, but it's an M6i instance family. We can see the storage, so on and so forth, number of nodes, and then connection details for the cluster endpoint. So if you go ahead and press that link, it will then pop up a pop-up which actually gives you the details of how to connect to the cluster, including the DNS name, because we will provision DNS for the cluster endpoint. We will also provision a DNS name for each of the nodes. If you go to just press this nodes link, you can get access to similar information for the nodes so that your application can connect to a specific node. You can use that information to connect your development tools. So pretty much any development tool that will, for example, like dbeaver, which works on your laptop to connect with ClickHouse, it'll work just fine to connect to Altinity.Cloud. If you just want to do quick queries, you can use what's called the Explore tab. So it's on the dashboard, and that gives you a quick little query editor. It's very simple, but the nice thing about it is it allows you to go to specific clusters, and then you can pick. This is saying where it says node any, that means it's going to the cluster endpoint, so it'll just pick one. And for queries where you don't care which node you land on, you can also pick specific nodes. So this is pretty handy. So speaking of logging in, you probably want to know how to create users. So when you're first developing, there will be a default user, but you really have to go, what you really want to do is go create your own users. And so there's a very simple way to do this. You go to the configure tab and you just click that, you'll hit users, and then it'll pop up uh, a modal dialog, which will allow you to fill in the user details. If you are a ClickHouse user, you may recognize the information here as exactly what appears when you do an XML based user. Uh, in other words, a file-based user definition out on ClickHouse. That's exactly what's happening here. So we don't recommend doing a huge number of these. It's actually far better to go ahead and create one login. In this case, I'm just calling it root. Give it a password. I can restrict databases, but what's most interesting is you just enable this switch called access management. And what this will do is it'll allow this user to issue what are called SQL RBAC commands, so role-based access control, and you can create more users. It's a much more flexible model that then creates the users instantly through SQL. So we recommend doing that. And and if you create this user root, you can then just log in with a normal client. And here's an example of using it. So we log in with ClickHouse client, and then we can go create another user using the RBAC command. The nice thing about this is this propagates instantly. It's also totally under the control of your application. So that's a way to get started with users. By the way, when you create a user using that dialog that I just showed you, it typically takes a minute or two for that user to propagate out, because what's actually happening is Altinity.Cloud is actually updating the file system where each of the the ClickHouse nodes is running, and making that sort of provisioning that little XML file that defines the user. Once that file is properly loaded onto the node and ClickHouse notices it, your user then appears. Other things that you can do. So the Explore tab has a bunch of useful stuff, particularly when you're getting started. It's very useful for looking at your schema. There are many things you do in the design process, but one thing that just about everybody does is look at the data side and data size, look at the number of partitions that are being created. So for example, look at the number of bytes per row, compression ratios, things like that. You can see that instantly using this schema tab. There's also the workload tab, which Alexander showed. That's very useful to see, what queries you're running and how long they're taking, things like that. Very quick to use. And then there's a variety of DBA tools that are for more advanced use cases like detecting detached parts. Final thing on analytics is I mentioned that earlier on that ClickHouse has this enormous ecosystem of analytic sort of open source analytics software. Here's just a list of a few of the things that are commonly used for building analytic stacks. They include event streaming. They include extract, transfer, load, including Apache Spark, which of course is also heavily used for machine learning and AI. There are a bunch of tools to do display, very innovative ones. I've just mentioned 3 of the more popular ones. And then, of course, client libraries for just about every single language. There are many other things beside this, but the point is that you can build the entire stack using open source and so that you can both, which has the advantage that you can both see what's going on, plus you have control. You're able to move it around. You're able to go to different environments. You don't have to worry about it. It future proofs your applications in fundamental ways. So that is the kind of the basics on development and stuff you would see early on. Let's talk a little bit about how you would operate your application. This is sometimes called day 2. And for this, we're going to dig in a little bit more deeply. Again, another picture of what does a ClickHouse server look like? Because this enables us to understand how some of the operations like Rescale are actually working under the covers and what they're really doing. So here's the ClickHouse server pod. It is every pod or every ClickHouse server node has a VM that's backing it. And then it has network attached block storage. We can also use object storage, of course. But if we want to restart that, for example, it's very simple just to go out to the node, and we can do a full cluster restart. We can also restart individual nodes. For example, if you want to restart the cluster, just go ahead to Actions, hit that drop down, and restart, I think, is the top one on the list. And then you press OK. If you don't hit this checkbox, what it will do is it will go around and do a rolling restart. Altinity.Cloud is pretty smart about restarts. By default, it's going to let queries finish when you do a restart. So what this means is actually, if there is a case where you want to do a smooth restart, it could take a while because you have queries that may be running for a while, and it will take, if they take a while to drain out, that will gate how quickly we can do the restart. The actual restart of the server tends to be quick on small systems, but again, on large systems, there are other things which cause it to be slow. For example, if you have very large numbers of files, that could also contribute to restart time. So another thing that Alexander mentioned, of course, is turning off compute. And this is a great feature of Kubernetes, that we can just make the pods go away, but keep the network attached storage. So you can basically scale to 0. You can do that manually at any time. So there's a stop cluster action, which is just to suspend it. You can then resume it whenever you decide to do so. We do this very commonly for development. And one of the really cool features that I use constantly is that when you resume your cluster, you can change the node type. So in effect, you could be developing with a very small node type, and then you could pause it, and then when you resume, maybe you want to do a test, so you can up the node size. This is super handy for jumping back and forth between different node sizes depending on what you're doing when you restart. So it's in this case, we're restarting it with a very relatively large node size with 32 vCPUs. What's even better, though, for restarts, particularly if you're in development or have a system that's not used 24/7, is you can do what's called an uptime schedule. I set these in development. I usually put them to 2 hours of inactivity, and that means if I go to lunch or forget about it, the compute will just turn off at that time, and that basically keeps particularly for development systems, that allows you to have development systems that use very little, actually cost very little. There's also, you can do it on a schedule where you can basically pick times of days and times of those days during the week where the cluster will operate automatically. This is a super useful feature just in general, and is one of the big ways that we can do effective cost control. Scaling. So Alexander showed you the rescale. Again, this works well partly because of the way that Kubernetes works underneath, and the fact that block storage can be reattached to different sized VMs. This is some of the secret sauce behind this. And so if you go to the rescale page that Alexander showed you, you have a couple options. You can scale horizontally, which is what Alexander showed, where he increased the number of shards and the number of replicas to go from 1 each to 2 by 2. You can also scale vertically, which you do by increasing the node type, or either making the node type bigger or smaller. You can also add to storage. You cannot take storage away, but you can add to it. And this is actually really important. As Alexander said, that's probably the most common scaling operation we deal with, because data sizes in active systems tend to grow over time. And what's going on under the cover is, when we do the vertical scaling, there's a couple of different things. We can just change the VM size. When you select a different VM size, what will happen is the old VM will get terminated, and then we'll simply provision a new one and reattach it to the block storage. When we extend storage, there's a couple things we can do. We will either extend an individual volume. On GCP, this is the main way that we, in fact, this is the way we extend storage. On Amazon, what we tend to do is stack volumes. So allow the volume to grow to a certain size, but it turns out with Amazon Block Storage, you get better performance if you have multiple volumes attached to your VM. This is something that we've tested extensively. So that's what allows the scaling. One thing that's important is you cannot reduce storage once you have allocated it, but you can always increase it. And then horizontal scaling, replicas and shards, that is done automatically by the operator. It's a very simple, from a user perspective, a very simple operation. There is some magic that goes on underneath to add the replicas, and they basically, if we're scaling up, or and for example, adding a replica, what we will do is we're going to go ahead and alter the cluster metadata to say, hey, there's more replicas on the way, so that everybody knows what the names are. And then what we'll do, this is a really cool feature, is if we add a new replica or a new shard, we will automatically provision the schema on it. So any replicated tables will automatically get defined on the new replica, including a replica and a new shard when it shows up. And then for those, in the case of a replica, then once that replica comes up and connects to the cluster through data replication, it will automatically pick up the contents of whatever tables it's sharing with other replicas. One thing that ClickHouse does not do is if you provision a new shard, it will not automatically move data over. There are ways to this is just a feature in ClickHouse that it doesn't do automatic rebalancing across shards, at least not yet. But there's various ways of doing it manually, and we can help you with that. Backups, of course, everybody wants to know that their data are protected. They run automatically every 24 hours. There's 7 days of backups by default. You can restore one at any time simply by going into actions, clicking restore backup. You can create one manually at any time. If you're doing something where you feel a little nervous, you can go ahead and kick one off. They may take a while to, depending on how big your data size is, they could take a while to run. But that facility is available. And then finally, there's upgrade and downgrade. So this is a really critical feature because it completely automates the upgrade or downgrade operation, as the case may be, and it also does it in a round robin fashion. So you simply go in, you pick upgrade on the cluster. You can go ahead and pick either, you have the usual choice between Altinity builds versus community builds. Pick the version you want to go to. It's a rolling upgrade so that it won't take as long as you have replicas, it will not take your system offline. And if you can also downgrade, of course. This warning here is just showing me, hey, I'm about to do a major downgrade. In fact, this is one that possibly wouldn't work because it's possible there may be changes to the data that would be inconsistent. So it gives me a warning, and that's like something that says, hey, maybe you want to talk to support before you do that. In fact, it's a good time to talk about about best practices for upgrade, because this is an important operation. It's a place where there tend to be problems. So one of the things we recommend strongly is if it's appropriate, use Altinity stable builds. We're not pushing this, just because it's Altinity. It's because these builds have been tested. They are stable. They tend to contain fewer sort of random bugs and changes. The other thing is that the Altinity stable builds have fairly extensive upgrade notes. So if you're moving from say 21.8 to 22.3, we document things that you have to watch out for during the upgrade, and it enables you to upgrade more safely. It's really important to test upgrades, and with ClickHouse, that's actually with Altinity.Cloud, that's pretty easy to do. What you can do is just go ahead before you do an upgrade, open up that backup wizard, and you can restore a backup into a new cluster. And so with basically 3 key clicks, you can have a new cluster set up. Go ahead and load your data into it, run your upgrade there, connect your I've got these flipped. You could connect your event streams like Kafka. You could connect your apps, run your upgrade. make sure everything works, and then you can just throw the cluster away as soon as you're done. And at that point, that should enable you to flush out sort of obvious things. We do recommend strongly that people test upgrades, particularly on mission critical systems. And the reason is that ClickHouse evolves really quickly, and you might not necessarily hit bugs, but ClickHouse behavior changes. The biggest thing that people hit and upgrade is that things like aggregate functions may have different behavior, may have different numbers of arguments in new releases. And what'll happen is you'll need to change your apps. So going through this process will enable you to pick that off. And then the final thing is check with us. This is one of the key things that Altinity support does. This is why we do support, because there are things like this with ClickHouse where you really need advice from experts. And we also ask that if you're doing a major upgrade, let us know beforehand, because then we can make sure that one, we can help you check what you're doing, give you advice in advance. We're also aware that you're doing it and can make sure that there's somebody there to help you quickly if you run into problems. Monitoring, this isn't a super long talk, but we have lots of great stuff. There are three different types of monitoring panels. Cluster metrics is one that shows things like number of inserts, merge activity, the amount of queries you're running, load average on the system. You also have a nice screen to show your queries, show your top end queries, for example, and then you have access to logs. These are all easily accessible. You just click that view in Grafana button or link, and it just gives you this drop down, and you just pick them and they'll pop up in another window. Another thing that you can get to is system status. So you go over to find your name. In my case, it's Robert Hodges. I just go ahead, click that, and I'll see system status. If I punch that, that's actually a link, and it gets me to my environment status page. So that's useful if you just want to see the general health of the system. I will warn you, it doesn't catch everything. Like most status pages, you can have transient failures due to, say GCP deciding it's time for, like, one of your VMs goes south and GCP just automatically replaces it. You can see outages like that. Every now and then they won't, if they're fast enough, they won't show up on the system status, but it gives you a good overview sense of what's going on with your system. Let's talk a little bit about security. I don't have too much more time, but I'd like to go ahead and just introduce you to a few of the highlights. Protecting your applications and your data. So there's a lot of protection built into ClickHouse already. So, or excuse me, into Altinity.Cloud. So for example, all traffic is TLS encrypted. We will, with rare exceptions, the only exceptions are things like if you want to talk MySQL protocol, there's parts of that are not fully encrypted, so you have to do a special request to us to do that. But in general, if you're connecting through the HTTP port or the internal port, everything's TLS encrypted. We will not allow you to connect if you don't do that. What you can do to increase the security is use IP whitelisting. That's something you can set up. We skimmed over it in the when Alexander was doing the demo of starting cluster. You can also go back and add additional IP addresses to your whitelist at any time. Another thing you can do, which is very common, is set up a VPC endpoint. So you can use private networking so that the VPC that we are running, all traffic is then shared with your VPCs over a private network that's basically not visible to anyone else. So that's a very, very common feature. You just request it and we will set it up for you. It's quite quick. So those are important security mechanisms to think about, to protect your applications. Another thing that comes up pretty commonly is, hey, like, we know that we can use encryption and other things, but what about Altinity? What can you guys see? Well, that question came up often enough that we actually have a feature which is on the cluster dashboard where you can control the level of access that we get to your data. And so, for example, if you just press this Altinity access button, it pops up this modal dialog, and you can select anything from no access whatsoever to full access. So this is a development database we're working with, so we've given ourselves full access, but you could say, hey, you can only have access to the system tables. That's a reasonable one, which means our support people can look into the information in the system tables to help you diagnose a bug, but they cannot run queries on any of the databases containing your data. Read-only access, we get to see everything, but we can't change it. In full access, we can do anything. And then there are things like disabling cluster configuration management or actions. You can check those as you want. But this gives you control over who can get in there and mess with the data. And then a final thing is inviting new users. It's really easy to do. When you start with Altinity, you get, for example, a trial. You get an account that's tied to your email. If you want to add more people to the organization, you just go into the cluster dashboard and hit this share link, and then you can just type in emails, and they'll get an automatically generated invite that will allow them to connect. Last part of this presentation. By the way, if you have questions, please feel free to queue them up. We do have time for Q&A and would love to provide additional information. So how does the enterprise support work? This is one of the unique features of Altinity.Cloud. We have been doing support for ClickHouse since 2017. We've been in the market longer than anybody else. We've helped hundreds of customers ranging from tiny crypto startups all the way to, in some cases, Fortune 100 companies. Actually, there's one F10 company in there. So we've dealt with a lot of stuff. And this is important because ClickHouse is a pretty complex piece of software. It's incredibly powerful, but that power requires that you have some knowledge about how it works inside, as well as what the, what are sort of, what are the latest PRs that have been added, new features, things like that. That's our job, to keep track of that stuff. So the enterprise support, you can file cases. You can use Slack. You can use Zendesk. We prefer that for actual outages and things like that, that use Zendesk, because the tracking is just easier for everybody. But the types of things that we can help you with are everything from questions on schema design to how do I optimize performance. Like a common one is how to get better compression, troubleshooting problems, particularly in live systems, how to do upgrades, how to do capacity planning. Of course, integrations with these things, Kafka BI, what should be libraries here, and then just random questions like, how do I migrate from, hey, I'm migrating from this side of the other system, or, hey, I have like a crazy crypto query that I'm trying to do. We get those, we get like some really, really interesting queries. I'm trying to do something complicated. Show me how to do it in a simpler way. We love questions like that, and can answer them for you. And as I say, you can get a shared Slack channel with us. That's a great way to do sort of back and forth communication. And then there's Zendesk, which we use for more heavy duty things like, hey, you got a production outage, we need to track it and make sure that it gets closed. Open a Zendesk ticket. Some of the things that will help you get the most out of this support is just a few things. As I say, log the production issues in Zendesk. That's very important, and it's mostly to make sure that we can both see that it's getting to closure. Another thing is to contact us in advance if you're doing something big. So you have like a mission critical system. You really don't want to, and you're doing an upgrade on Saturday night. That's fine, because we have people across every time zone. But you probably don't want to call us, at 11 p.m. on Saturday night when it's gone wrong already. What's better is contact us in advance, because we can help advise you on what you're doing. Be it an upgrade. Another one that's important to contact us in advance is if you have a scale out operation that may require raising quotas. Because we allow everybody to run anywhere, you can actually hit quota limits that, as long as we know them in advance, we can actually ensure that you don't have a problem. So please, let us know about that stuff. Let us help you, and your system will work much better. And then finally, just don't wait for problems. So we can help you up front. Feel free to ask questions on anything. we really, our support team isn't just DBAs. They're people who have operated very large clusters, they have a lot of experience with ClickHouse, development of analytics on ClickHouse and other databases. And another thing that we often do, for particularly if you have a big project, we'll set up a regular call to touch base with you, make sure that you're making progress, make sure that issues are getting cleared. This is something that you should take advantage of so that you get the most out of the support and make the fastest progress. So that's it. Let me just say one thing. How do you get started with this magic? It's pretty easy. So you just go to our website and you can see the different ways that we can support you. There's Altinity.Cloud, that's running it in our VPCs. There is Altinity.Cloud Anywhere, that's running it in your own VPCs on Kubernetes. And then if you're just pure on-prem, like you're doing embedded systems, or you're entirely self-managed, we have ClickHouse support. If you want to get started on it, so for example, if you want to get started with Altinity.Cloud Anywhere, just click this link. You can come in and read about it. You can actually get started. You just fill out a form, and this will kick off a free 2-week trial where you can try it out. You'll get full support, evaluate whether this is the right thing for you. So with that, we're at the top of the hour. I'll return to the slideshow. These slides will be published. We will also publish the recording for everybody who signed up. At this point, I'd like to open it up. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to put them into the Q&A box or put them into chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. And Alexander, thanks again for your help on this presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Robert.
Great. All right. So looking, okay, don't be shy, folks. I see a number of people out there. Feel free to ask questions. Okay, I don't see too many questions getting queued up here. We will go ahead and call this a day. Thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate you joining us, and hope this has been helpful. And we look forward to seeing you on Altinity.Cloud. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.